The transatlantic alliance, once the anchor of the liberal order, was jolted by Donald Trump's presidency. The imposition of steep tariffs on European steel and aluminum in 2018 signaled a shift from partnership to confrontation. The Trump administration justified these tariffs as national security measures, leaving European leaders baffled. How could close allies be labeled threats? This wasn't a routine trade spat. It was a deliberate bypass of the very institutions America helped build, like the WTO. The message from Washington was clear: relationships would now be transactional. European capitals, used to predictability, suddenly faced an unpredictable U.S. economic adversary. The threat of further tariffs, especially on European cars, created ongoing uncertainty and eroded trust. The language of partnership gave way to talk of leverage and retaliation, forcing the EU to rethink its strategic position. The tariffs were just one part of a broader pattern of American unilateralism, including withdrawals from key international agreements. Europe realized it could no longer be a passive bystander. It needed to build its own pillars of stability. The tariffs hit Europe's industrial heartland hard, targeting $6.4 billion of EU exports. German steelmakers, Italian metalworkers, and Belgian manufacturers faced tough choices: absorb costs or lose U.S. market share. The threat of auto tariffs sent shockwaves through Germany's economy, with studies warning of significant GDP losses. Investment slowed as companies hesitated, and the pain rippled through interconnected supply chains across the continent. Countries with strong manufacturing and U.S. export ties, like Germany and Italy, suffered most, but the single market meant all felt the impact. This shared vulnerability fostered a sense of collective grievance and a drive for a common European solution. The tariffs exposed Europe's over-reliance on a single, unpredictable partner and the risks of weaponized trade policy. European businesses scrambled to adapt, but short-term fixes couldn't solve the deeper strategic problem. The era of passive reliance was over. Strategic autonomy became a necessity. Rather than escalate the tariff war, Europe targeted the root of U.S. power, the dollar's global dominance. The EU began quietly reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasury securities, signaling waning faith in American economic stability. Simultaneously, the European Commission pushed to expand the euro's international role, especially in energy contracts. European countries started paying for critical imports in euros, reducing exposure to U.S. sanctions and currency swings. This dual strategy, diversifying reserves and promoting the euro, marked a sharp break from the past. The Trump-era tariffs forced Europe to see monetary policy as a tool of power, not just economics. By building up the euro, the EU aimed to insulate itself from U.S. political whims and reshape the global financial system. Europe's response was subtle but strategic, a quiet counterstrike. The groundwork was laid for a more independent European financial future. Trump's tariffs, indiscriminate and blunt, unexpectedly unified the EU's 27 member states. The threat to industries like steel and autos, deeply integrated across Europe, gave new urgency to the idea of European unity. Instead of individual countries negotiating separately, the EU empowered the European Commission to act as the single negotiator. This presented a united front of 450 million consumers, far more formidable than any single nation. The EU's response was swift and strategic, filing a WTO dispute and imposing targeted tariffs on iconic U.S. products. These moves were designed to maximize political impact in the U.S. while upholding the rules-based order. The trade dispute became a catalyst for broader discussions on European strategic autonomy, extending to defense and digital policy. Even traditional U.S. allies within Europe backed the unified stance, showing the depth of the shift. The adversity of the tariffs forged a stronger, more cohesive EU, determined to chart its own course. Europe's unity became its greatest strength in the face of American pressure. Europe's resolve translated into concrete actions, especially in Germany and France. Germany began shifting its massive energy imports to euro-based contracts, insulating itself from U.S. policy volatility. France, under Macron, championed a stronger European financial system, pushing for deeper euro-denominated capital markets. Paris led efforts to create European industrial funds and investment vehicles to rival US and Chinese giants. The rhetoric from leaders like Merkel and von der Leyen shifted from partnership to self-reliance, signaling a new era. Even traditionally Atlanticist countries like the Netherlands backed the EU's unified stance and the push for a stronger euro. The consensus stretched across the continent. Economic and financial autonomy was now a shared goal. The US actions had achieved what years of EU debate could not: a powerful, continent-wide consensus. Europe was no longer content to follow, it was ready to lead. The strategic shift was real, deep, and irreversible. Initially, Washington dismissed Europe's response as ineffective, believing the EU too divided to challenge US dominance. But as Europe's coordinated strategy became clear, unease grew in American financial circles. Wall Street analysts began warning of the risks to the dollar's global status, noting a slow decline in its share of central bank reserves. Media and policy experts cautioned that aggressive US trade and sanctions policies were incentivizing the world to seek alternatives. By 2020, even US officials acknowledged the risk. The EU's quiet counterstrike was a real present-day challenge. Treasury reports started analyzing threats to the dollar's role, revealing growing concern beneath official confidence. The combination of Europe's unity, euro promotion, and reserve diversification was no longer a distant worry. America realized it was helping create the very outcome it feared: a world less dependent on the dollar. The awakening in Washington was slow but unmistakable. The strategic challenge from Europe could no longer be ignored. The EU's response was a masterclass in strategic patience, deliberate, measured, and long-term. Rather than escalate, Europe used institutional channels and financial shifts to build autonomy. Retaliatory tariffs, WTO cases, and euro promotion were designed for lasting impact, not headlines. The EU's approach wasn't about attacking the dollar, but about reducing dependence on it. As a consensus-based union, the EU's slow, methodical policymaking became a strength, preventing overreaction and ensuring broad support. The pivot away from dollar reliance was quietly implemented over years, outlasting political noise. Europe played a different game, focusing on the structural foundations of global power, not short-term wins. By strengthening the euro and its own financial systems, the EU prepared for a multipolar world. The quiet counterstrike was about shaping the future, not just reacting to Trump. The transatlantic trade disputes triggered profound shifts, forcing Europe to pursue true strategic autonomy. Europe's counterstrike wasn't about replacing the dollar, but building a more balanced, multipolar financial system. Plans include deepening the capital markets union and developing EU-issued bonds as alternatives to US treasuries. Strengthening financial infrastructure and payment systems will further insulate Europe from US sanctions. For the US, this means higher borrowing costs and diminished financial leverage as the world moves toward multiple reserve currencies. The Biden administration has tried to repair ties, but the strategic shift in Europe is here to stay. A world with several reserve currencies will be more complex, but power will be more distributed. For Europe, it's a chance to control its economic destiny. For the US, a warning that global leadership can't be taken for granted. The quiet counterstrike is still unfolding, but its direction is clear. The era of absolute dollar dominance is ending. A new financial world is taking shape.